Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 most hated cards in Hearthstone. Now, these aren't my personal most hated cards. I recently asked my community to name their favorite and least favorite cards. We've already covered their favorite cards, and these are the cards that people named as their very least favorite cards in Hearthstone. Now, one quick note, I did ask this right around the time that the nerfs to cards like Patches and Raza and Bone Mare were hitting constructed, not to mention Corridor Creeper. So there was a lot of hate around certain cards in certain decks that utilized those particular nerfed cards, and you're going to see some of those show up on the list that might seem like they shouldn't be all that hated today, but essentially in the Kobolds and Catacombs era, these were the cards that really just drove people crazy, that people can't stand, that they absolutely loathe to see across from them on their opponent's side of the board. So all that said, let's go ahead and jump into this list, the 10 most hated cards in the Kobolds and Catacombs era of Hearthstone. At the number 10 spot here, we actually have the card that took the number 1 spot on people's favorite cards. Somehow, believe it or not, Blood Reaver Gul'dan is also other people's most hated card. For everybody that plays Blood Reaver Gul'dan, apparently there are a handful that don't play Blood Reaver Gul'dan and absolutely hate when he's played. And of course, that is probably because usually when your opponent's playing Gul'dan, that's signaling that the game is over. They've stabilized, they've summoned 47 Doom Guards, 8 bajillion Void Lords, and you're essentially never going to win the game because they gain life, their hero power is oppressive, and there's just a mountain of demons to deal with. So it's almost impossible, it feels like sometimes, to beat those Gul'dan plays, and it feels bad to lose, so of course Gul'dan a lot of people are going to associate with losing. Completely understandable. This is one of the most played and most dominant cards in Hearthstone right now for what is considered probably the most oppressive deck with Q block. So not surprising to see this one on the list. If anything, I actually thought this one would be higher on the list, but I guess there are other cards which feel even more frustrating than this one. Speaking of other frustrating cards that dominate the meta, this is Spiteful Summoner. Now, this one actually doesn't see quite as much play today as it did sort of in the pre-nerf era, so this might be one of those cards that lingers around a little bit, but still in one of the most popular decks in the game, which is Spiteful Summoner Priest. That's a top 5 deck right now, so a card that you still see pretty often, and you frankly still lose to pretty often, because as soon as your opponent drops that Spiteful Summoner, they often get some enormous thing that you just can't deal with, and they've already played a pretty smooth curve up to that point, so they just steamroll you. You've barely held on, they drop the Spiteful Summoner, and that's essentially your death knell. They've gone ahead and nailed the coffin shut. The game is over, you can't win. So Spiteful Summoner summons a lot of the same negative feelings that Gul'dan does, but it does it even in a more frustrating way, I would say, and that's probably why it's a little bit higher on the list, because it comes earlier in the game, you haven't had as much time to influence how things are going to go. It feels more unfair often because it's just kind of a freebie thing. They haven't had to work for it, accruing mana or playing demons or sitting on a 10 mana card the entire game. So a problematic card, one of those high roll style cards, sort of a Barnes style card, and no surprise at all to me that it's on this list. I'm actually a little surprised, spoiler alert, Barnes is not on this list. That kind of shocked me because they're similar, and to me Barnes feels worse, but I think Spiteful Summoner, since it's a newer card, has been more synonymous with the expansion throughout the course of that meta. It's probably the one that has caught the most attention. So up next at the number 8 spot here, we have a card that really surprised me. This is Spreading Plague. Of course, an oppressive druid card that has been hated ever since it came out at Knights of the Frozen Throne, particularly at its previous mana cost pre-nerf. People absolutely loathe this card. But even nowadays, apparently, it's still fresh on people's minds, despite the fact that Druid's really not all that popular in the meta right now. Of course, there's a handful of Jade Druids that pop up, but not a deck that you see very often, so I'm stunned that this card is so hated, that people just absolutely abhor this one to such an extent that even though they're not seeing it on a daily basis, it still ranks on the top of their list. People name this as their absolute most hated card. So that tells you a lot of just how bad it feels to play into a Spreading Plague when your opponent gets a giant board of taunts that you just can't push through. It feels like your entire game plan has been shut down. That's really bad to play against, and it feels like you've been punished for doing things that are good or your deck is designed to do. That's never a great way to feel in Hearthstone, so no surprise to me that Spreading Plague is here. It's one of those cards that still feels a little bit overpowered at 6 mana sometimes, so I kind of feel the hatred for this one myself as well. Spreading Plague, I don't know how much I love this card. I don't know how good it is for Hearthstone. So, surprising, I suppose, but still a pretty fitting card for this list. And speaking of Druid cards, I'm going to go ahead and spoil it now. This is not the last Druid card on this list even. Ultimate Infestation also making the top 10 as most hated cards. Another card from Knights of the Frozen Throne where Druid just took over with all these high power cards. And despite the fact, again, that, Ultimate Infestation is not very common on ladder right now, still a card people absolutely love to hate. There's just something about knowing that your opponent is getting so much absurd value in a single card that feels really, really terrible to play against. And often because they're ramping so easily into their 10-mana Ultimate Infestation turns, it's very punishing. They happen so fast, you can just never recover. They get so many resources, they get the defense, they get the body. It's just everything you could want in a single card. And of course, also in combination with Spiteful Summoner and Grand Archivist in sort of a big spell Spiteful Druid, which is not super common. It's certainly not an everyday deck, but it's one of those things you run into occasionally, and multiple times throughout the Kobolds and Catacombs era has kind of popped into the tier 2 space of decks. Can make Ultimate Infestation feel even worse, because then it's rewarding other cards for existing in your deck and sometimes being played completely for free, which can be especially awful. So Ultimate Infestation, a card that's been a hated card for a very long time since Frozen Throne came out. Perhaps even more reasons to hate it today, so despite, again, the fact that you're not playing against it very often, still on the list. So moving on to the number 6 spot here, no surprise at all, it's Iceblock. There is a reason Iceblock is moving to the Hall of Fame, as it was recently announced. It's because it's very, very tough to play against Iceblock. It seems like your opponent completely removes your ability to win the game, which of course is the core gameplay mechanic of Hearthstone, reducing your opponent's health to 0, when your opponent can just deny you that opportunity time and time again with incredible consistency and predictability. That is very, very tough, and it's a horrible way to lose Hearthstone, in combination in particular with other mage cards that just stall out your board and seem to give them an endless opportunity to kill you in return. That's a miserable feeling. Nobody should have to do that. I think Iceblock had its time. It empowered some really interesting mage play. Back in the day, Freeze Mage was one of the most advanced Hearthstone decks to play, and that was really fun. But it was there long enough. Iceblock has been driving me crazy for something like 4 years now. I'm thrilled it's moving to the Hall of Fame. It will be a wild format exclusive card. We don't have to deal with this one in standard format anymore, and Mage can start to carve out a new path for itself towards success that doesn't rely on this just incredibly frustrating stall out your opponent game plan that is so annoying to play against. So moving into the top 5 here, we have our last Druid card on the list. This is Jade Idol. And once again, like the other Druid cards, not many Jade Idols on the ladder right now, but people hate this style of play so much, the ability to just get infinite cards and in fact turn those infinite cards into nearly infinitely large dudes that are seemingly impossible to fight against. And there's just some raw inevitability in knowing that you're going to lose the game eventually to a Jade Druid without some sort of direct counter in your deck, like Skulking Geist, for instance. There's basically nothing worse in Hearthstone than having to run a single card in every deck to just beat one other card that's run by a single class. That basically sums up why Jade Idol is just completely broken. This card doesn't make any sense to me. Jade Druid has been my bane ever since it arrived. I almost refuse to play the deck myself because I hate it so much. Thank you everyone who listed this card as your most hated. I'm right there with you. This one probably still to this day stays at the top of my list, so I think we're brothers in arms here. Down with Jade Idol. Its time is finally almost over, and I couldn't be happier about it. So as we move into the top 4 here is where we're going to start seeing some of the cards that probably wouldn't be on this list if I reran the poll today and asked people to name their most hated cards, but were certainly very top of mind pre-nerf when some of these people were first answering these questions. So up first is Prince Kelas F, a card which was everywhere on the ladder pre-nerf because it worked so darn well with another card, Patches, that, spoiler alert, will be on this list. Stay tuned. But since the fall of Patches and since the fall of sort of the generic tempo package with things like South Sea Captain and Cobalt Scalebane and Bone Mare that dominated so many different archetypes, Kelas F has sort of fallen alongside his brothers. Even though Kelas F himself didn't get nerfed or changed, the things he empowered and the style of deck he worked best in did get nerfed and has suffered, so he has certainly fallen away a little bit. Now, Kelas F can still see play occasionally in a couple different decks, but it's fairly rare at this point to see him. I think he will come back and maybe be hated again someday in the near future. Who knows, as new cards start to come out. but clearly a card that drove a lot of frustration because it felt like if your opponent hit Kelas F on 2, you lost the game. If they didn't hit Kelas F on 2, maybe you had a chance to win the game. And that sort of 50-50 high roll opportunity that has defined a lot of other cards in this list is clearly something people take ire with in Hearthstone, and it's exactly why Kelas F has made it into the top 4. And speaking of other cards that are on this list because they were named in the pre-nerf era, let's take a look at Shadow Reaper Anduin, a card which was clearly connected exactly to his brother Raza, which got nerfed before the nerf when Raza was reducing hero power to 0 mana. Of course, Highlander Priest was absolutely everywhere, dominant on the ladder, incredibly hard to play against because they could just kill you from seemingly nowhere, and they got so much pure value off of the Shadow Reaper Anduin hero power. That was a really hard way to play Hearthstone. It frankly sucked, right? Everybody kind of hated playing against Highlander Priest, and that's why Anduin's on this list. Now, since Raza has gotten nerfed, we're not seeing Highlander Priest anymore, except maybe played by yours truly as sort of a meme effort to revive the card. But outside of that, no longer a frustrating card, not something we see on ladder every day, but no surprise at all that this card is still on this list because, again, this list was made when those cards were in effect, and clearly this demonstrates just how much people really did hate Highlander Priest, and probably demonstrates perfectly just how much it needed a nerf. So moving on to the number 2 spot here, we have a card that is not something that was affected by the nerfs at all, but is a card you do absolutely see every day in Hearthstone right now. It is, of course, Void Lord for Warlock, the centerpiece of all of the new Warlock decks that feels so darn oppressive. Cube Lock, Control Lock, whichever sort of variation you play, both utilize Void Lord to great effect in combination with things like Skull of the Minari and Possessed Lackey. It turns out being able to cheat out this minion on something like turn 5 is really good because it's just so hard to get through. This card has single-handedly made Spellbreaker enter the meta in a bigger way than it ever had before because you simply have to have silence to answer Void Lords or Possessed Lackeys. It sucks to queue into a matchup and know that your chances of winning it are very slim just because your opponent runs a single card, and essentially Void Lord signifies, hey, guess what? You've been shut out. You've lost the game. You can still play aggro decks. You can still play minion-based aggro decks in this meta because you don't always match up against Warlock. But often when you do, it's just the worst feeling in the world to see that Void Lord dropped, and then they make another Void Lord, and then they cube their Void Lords, then there's a bunch of demons, and then guess what? 75 Void Lords come back on Gul'dan and Azoth. It's just crazy how much this card synergizes with every other piece of the Warlock puzzle, and it sort of connects them all together because it's a big defensive tool, it's a demon, it's a taunt, it's a death rattle. All of those things work to empower every other strong card in the Warlock deck. So even though Void Lord itself as a 9-mana card in a vacuum probably isn't that good, it's not even that oppressive or bad, when you put it in that puzzle with every other piece, man, this card is crazy good and crazy frustrating to play against sometimes. So clearly a good fit for the number 2 spot on this list. And finally at the number 1 spot, it's Patches the Pirate. This shouldn't be a shock for anyone, first off because I spoiled it earlier in the video, but also because this has probably been the most hated Hearthstone card ever. Now clearly Patches right now, today, something you probably don't hate too much because he's not really being played any. That's because he got nerfed. He no longer has charge. But the pre-nerf version was in every single deck, it seemed. Practically everybody, from aggro decks, of course, to control decks, found some way or another to run Patches. It felt like every game started with his incredibly annoying voice line. That alone is probably enough to earn him a spot on this list. But he also influenced games in such big ways too, particularly in combination with things like South Sea Captain, Kelas F. He's just one of the best cards Hearthstone's ever had, despite how meager he seems as a 1-mana 1/1. And finally, after years and years and years of oppression, it was really only 1 year, but it feels like forever, Blizzard finally nerfed Patches, and it was a great day indeed. And even Wild format's not going to have to suffer through Patches anymore, despite the fact that he was just going to rotate out too. And I'm glad Blizzard actually nerfed him and didn't just rely on the rotation to deal with Patches, because now even Wild format players don't have to deal with quite as an oppressive Patches as they used to would have. So ultimately, the perfect spot for this list, even though right now today he probably wouldn't make the number 1 spot. Still, I think a good recognition of how negatively patches has impacted the game and impacted so many people's view and perspective of the game. The most hated card forever and always, as far as I'm concerned, patches, is your #1 spot. And there you have it, folks. Those are the 10 most hated cards in Hearthstone. I do wish this list was a little more up to date, simply because the nerfs hit right at the wrong time. Some of these cards might look a little wacky, but I had to go by the raw data. I thought about removing some of the cards that were impacted by the nerfs, but that didn't feel true to the spirit of it. And I think even though these cards have been nerfed, they're still so fresh on people's minds that they're still probably rather hated. I still have so many bad feelings from patches. He's left a rather bad taste in my mouth, so despite the fact that I'm not seeing him every day on the ladder, guess what? I still hate him. He's still really, really bad. Same can be said for Jade Idol for me as well. All that said, though, guys, if you have thoughts, comments, questions on this list, of course, leave those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.